Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Welcome to episode 5 already of Exchange with Lula. Today we have a very interesting topic. We are going to speak about the future of South African manufacturing and the potential cancellation of the AGOA trade agreement. We have Thomas with us in the room, and we have Garth. Thomas, our CGO, Chief Growth Officer, and Garth, our CRO, Chief Risk Officer. And they're both going to be sharing some insights about the cancellation. So I will kick off. We're going to start. They're going to talk to us, talk us through the cancellation, what that could mean. We're going to do a bit of a demo of our product, and then we'll have a time for questions. So if there are any questions you have as Thomas or Garth are speaking, you're welcome to pop it in the chat, and we will get to all the questions at the end. So over to Thomas.
Morning, folks. Cool. So we've got a topical subject today that we're going to try and cover. We're going to talk through AGOA. And so the US's trade agreement for a number of sub-Saharan African countries. We want to touch a little bit on what is it today? What does it actually mean for South Africa? So how important is it to us actually? And in particular, a few industries that are central to South Africa, how it might impact us if there is a suspension, and potentially what businesses in South Africa, SMEs in affected industries could think about possibly doing to mitigate some of the impact. And so you've probably, if you are following it or you're in a relevant industry, it's something that you probably have been tracking. There are many different views on it. We're not going to cover, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Anything like that today. More on what could it mean? And so I think it's quite relevant. But first, let's start with what is it? What is AGOA? And really, so the full name, that African Growth and Opportunity Act, it was a trade agreement that the US set up with South Africa back in the year 2000. And basically, the US didn't have any specific trade agreements with African countries. They wanted to improve their relations in the region. And so there was an eligibility framework set up for the program. And by meeting certain criteria, you could become a member that would benefit from a number of free trades. So basically, removing tariffs on certain goods, providing access to the US. So as I said, set up in 2000, really to try and drive economic growth, promote job creation. In many ways, it does benefit US consumers. So it's getting African goods into the US market at hopefully a cheaper rate, so that if South Africa, for instance, was applying tariffs on exports to the US, that would inflate the cost of goods going into the US. That's not something that they wanted at the time. So how did they stimulate growth and make sure there is more flow of goods and trade? Something that's really important to understand about AGOA, it's not a permanent thing, and it never has been. So it was set up in the year 2000. It was up for renewal in 2015. It had a 10-year extension at that point in time. So there is a renewal deadline looming for the 30th of September for this agreement as a whole. And what could that mean for all of the eligible African countries? Possibly it could be changed quite fundamentally, given the current administration and current setup in the US. It could be changed quite a lot before it's renewed. Maybe it's not renewed at all, although that seems quite unlikely. And what we do know about kind of the way the US is working at the moment, they prefer kind of bilateral, more kind of transactional trades or more transactional agreements rather than these broad programs. Another interesting thing to note is this is not the first time South Africa's been threatened with suspension or exclusion from access to the trade agreement. So back in 2015, Obama tried to have SA suspended. And that was very much around some protectionist policies in the US view of agri in South Africa. So that would be, why should South Africa benefit from transfers of or duty, kind of lower tariffs on goods going to the US, agri goods, but it wasn't working the other way in their view. A couple of other things to note that it's not the first time any country has been threatened with suspension and then had that followed through on. Very recent history, you've got Uganda, Ethiopia, and Burundi suspended. Most of those are for human rights related issues rather than trade. And so what are the eligibility criteria? And I think this is quite important to understand, because why would the US specifically exclude South Africa? Why would we no longer be eligible and basically be suspended? And it's very much to do with our relationship with the US, but also how they view us as an actor internationally. So that market-based economy being promoting that market economy, protection of rights. In this case, rights to property, which is a hot topic in South Africa and something that the US has taken a view on. Then there's the rule of law. So, are we a legally fair system? Is it a transparent system? Back in 2015, as I mentioned, Obama was looking at elimination of barriers to US trade and investment. So, that was the issue back then that eventually was never kind of followed through on. Policies to reduce poverty, probably not given US aid being cut to South Africa on a number of fronts, probably not the biggest driver. Corruption, human rights, labor rights, and not undermining US interests. So, arguably, South Africa is undermining certain US interests. Ignoring the politics of it, what is the impact, I think, is what we're going to more talk to today. But these are nonetheless pretty interesting things to understand about that relationship. And
maybe if I can add something in there as well, Thomas, is you don't get anything for free. So there are no free lunches here. So the US setting up AGOA wasn't purely a humanitarian or a kind thing to do. They want something from it. And I think that's the key here, is in order to keep getting the benefits of AGOA and the free access to the US for certain industries, there are criteria we have to fulfill. So it's really important that as a country, we are doing what we can to, should we want to keep the AGOA agreement active, is doing what we can to ensure that we aren't undermining our own efforts to do that.
Cool. So, I mean, what would those efforts be? Like, what's our motivation to stay, or how much value are we placing on it? So I think something that's interesting to note is, in terms of like the balance of trade between South Africa and the US exports more to South Africa than they import from South Africa. So basically, the balance of trade is going the US way. But in terms of what we are exporting, what does that mean? So, our exports to the US are quite significant. It's 8 to 9 billion annually, falling under this AGOA kind of broader umbrella. And I think something to understand about the impact on our overall economy, there are split views. So in terms of real, like, substantive impact, AGOA represents less than 0.1% of South Africa's GDP. So suspension at a national level isn't necessarily going to have massive impact on our economy in terms of like the bottom line. And many folks are arguing it this way. What does it really represent materially? That 0.1% of GDP isn't significant. We could probably find that somewhere else. I think the key to understand here is as Lula and for a number of our customers is the industry impact. And so it can have an outsized impact on certain key industries. So looking at it from a macro perspective, maybe not that impactful in terms of the rands and cents. Looking at it from kind of like an industry perspective, it can be quite fundamental. And, you know, I think what Garth was alluding to is like that broader context. It's not necessarily AGOA and the rands and cents that might make a difference, but it's, you know, overall access to Western markets, how we're viewed, trade outside of the agreement itself, and entire supply chains that we should be thinking through. So, you know, a bit of rough maths here from our side, and just doing a bit of research on the net and understanding our own kind of industries. You know, can we estimate the loss for AGOA? So we can imply a potential loss, and I think it's important here. What are those industries that are going to be impacted? I'll highlight where some of our biggest trade partners are in some of these industries. And then the other thing is not all products that are actually exported to the US benefit. And I think one of the key industries, we framed this very much on the manufacturing side of things, but it's key to understand that automotive is probably where we're going to see the most significant impact. So you'll have the likes of BMW in South Africa highlighting just how important and vital AGOA is. And I think, you know, it's relevant to understand what that supply chain might look like, what the impact of that might be. But about 29% of all our automotive exports go to the US. At a country level, the US is our second largest destination for automotive products. Once you look at that at a regional level, and I'll share some numbers now, the picture looks a little bit different. But, you know, almost a third of our exports going that way is pretty substantive. And depending on what year you're looking at, up to, you know, 42%, but in that region of 40% of those exports are benefiting from AGOA, being kind of the implied benefit of, you know, up to 12% of those total exports benefiting. That's pretty material. And so I think it's if you're in the automotive kind of manufacturing sector or within that supply chain, the suspension of AGOA could have a massive impact. Even if you're a supplier to people that are, you know, ultimate goods are getting sent that way, it's probably going to have a big impact. And then in terms of the labor impact, that could be quite large.
And I think maybe just to balance this as well, just on the automotive side, I think what's important is our exports are twofold. So obviously, they are the completed automobiles that we export, which would be right-hand drive, so they wouldn't be to the US market. So they'd be effectively protected in this sort of environment. But what is important is the platinum and the PGMs, the platinum group metals, which are exported to the US, and they're part of the automotive process. So the platinum forms part of the catalytic converters of cars. And it's vital for any gasoline or petrol-driven car to remove toxic fumes. So the question is, South Africa produces somewhere between 70 and 75% of the world's platinum. The next biggest is Russia. The US needs those for their cars. So the question there is, on a more positive view, is would they cut off their nose to spite their face by not allowing us access to the market and just making those more expensive for their manufacturing? They can't really source them in other places. I think Zimbabwe's up there as a big producer as well. But if you look at the percentage of their options, they possibly wouldn't do that. And then in terms of, I suppose we can go into the rest of them, but if it is 12% of your production ultimately that's being impacted, are there other markets globally where we can see these industries shifting their exports rather than just to the US? So sorry, Thomas, I think that's just
yeah, no, very valid to understand. And then we're not going to explore it too much here, but you can find online case studies of nations that have been suspended or are no longer eligible to access some of that tariff relief under this agreement any longer. So Ethiopia is a really good example, and their textile industry and how dependent they were on US market, and how they've successfully pivoted to other markets is probably a really good case study to look at. You know, other industries, I think you're going to hear quite a lot of noise in the agri side of things. Ultimately, you know, this is that 2015 threatened suspension was like very much focused on like perceived imbalance in protection in South Africa versus opening up the market for South Africa and the US. You know, we're talking there about 5% potentially. I think citrus, nuts, those industries in particular are a focus. The reality is as well, like, you know, there is quite a lot of demand for South African fruit and citrus products in particular. Is it possible that we could find that 5% could be taken up elsewhere beneficially for us? And then in terms of the other manufactured side, we're talking about manufacturing. So looking at chemicals and manufactured goods, textiles. And again, we're not talking massive rand and cents kind of impact here. I mean, these are big numbers when you know, at a macro level, you know, 1 to 2% of an industry is a big number. But fundamentally, is it going to be impossible to find somewhere else for those goods to go? Potentially not, if we're smart about it. If South Africa is you know, generating trade agreements with other regions or blocks, trading blocks, or other countries in terms of bilateral agreements. You know, there are options out there if we're proactive about this. So let's dive a little bit into the automotive industry and like kind of transport equipment. So some of the numbers here, and these are quite big, but in 2013, the export value of kind of the supply chain reached 270 billion rand. That was about 14.7% of the country's total exports at that point in time. So sizable, something that, you know, we do need to be cognizant of this. At a regional level, it was the EU that was our like the dominant trading partner or dominant destination, and then Africa as a region being second, which is pretty good news, right? Never mind that, you know, the East and China definitely has a growing automotive sector in itself. I think we can see that just by some of the models, makes and models driving on our roads today. That's a whole new sector that's opening up. At a national level, though, Germany by far the most significant country, and the US quite a distant second. But again, it's second in terms of our largest national destination for automotive exports, so meaningful. And yeah, I mean, so Garth highlighted passenger cars. That's mostly Germany and the EU, or, you know, other regions where they want to supply, you know, the right-hand drive vehicles. But as Garth highlighted, catalytic converters, engine parts, tires, these are all important things to note. And then at a jobs level, I think something really important to highlight for South Africa, you know, we're talking about 116,000 highly skilled manufacturing jobs with the OEMs themselves, but in that supply chain, up to 500,000 formal jobs in the overall supply chain. So from a labor perspective, from a work perspective, meaningful, even if we're talking about that 12% of the market being affected directly by the agreement. Look, what we're not talking about here is the potential indirect. So no longer being eligible for AGOA itself, would that exclude us or impact the trade that isn't currently factored into AGOA? And probably, you know, that's a reality as well. So could it be more than the 12% that's impacted? Absolutely. So this is probably the industry that we need to think most about. On the other side, manufacturing, I think there's a very long tail here. to think through. So, I mean, just in terms of product lines, we're talking thousands of product lines. Even if the percentage of these goods benefiting from AGOA itself isn't there. And then on the agri side, again, like not a massive proportion of the exports benefiting here, but could there be impact down the line? So let's talk about some of those impacts then. At a broader level, this trade agreement is basically so that the US had like some of these tariff benefits to goods that were being directed towards their market. So yes, it could make things more expensive for their market, but what could it mean for us? So reducing foreign direct investment. So if we're in their supply chain or we've got industries that are relevant to their supply chain, US firms have got an incentive to invest. So if they're able to buy the goods at a preferential rate from South Africa, they've got an incentive to invest in that supply chain, support it, make it more resilient. And so there are dollars that could be flowing and definitely are flowing into SA to establish and grow and help with innovation in those key verticals. That's something that we've got to understand the impact of, because with those investments, we're probably able to reach other markets. Whoever, whichever other markets we're looking to maybe substitute for, some of our trade with that we might lose out with the US, are we going to be getting the same benefits? Something very, very important to think through. Then just reduction in trade with the US overall. So some US buyers, just with the threat, might even look to switch away from SA if they feel that they're a partial, or maybe if there's not a suspension now, but in September under the renewal there might be an impact. Then you don't want to run the risk of a key supplier or a supply country, supply corridor being impacted. And so you're probably going to look away. And again, this speaks to the investments, the buying. If you're looking to buy into a supply chain, you're looking at 2 and 3 years of purchases. You're not just looking at next month. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's important.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, I think the converse is exactly true as well, is the renewal of an AGOA agreement gives you another 10 years, where it sends a really good message to US companies, buyers on that side as well, that they can invest over the long term. So, the renewal itself is actually just a really good message that there's a long-term trade agreement and it's a promising place to do business.
And then, I mean, just overall negative impacts on economic growth, job creation. I mean, we know that we're actually losing jobs in real terms in South Africa. So it's not just an unemployment rate that's been of concern in the last year. There are fewer formal jobs than there were specifically in the SME sector. And so as that impacts some of these key industries that are quite labor intensive in the manufacturing and the agri side, it could have an outsized impact on employment as well. And yeah, so impact potentially on the industries for automotive, just that competitiveness. So if tariffs are increased, we're just not as competitive as maybe goods coming from a different market where they're not subject to those tariffs. And so could our export revenue there dip, and could the job losses be experienced there? And same thing in terms of manufacturing on, textiles, apparel in particular. If we got less volume going out, that might impact overall volume and output and productivity and innovation and all those things. So very much like long-term impact here, I think, is what we're highlighting versus like an immediate rands and cents overall impact. So kind of going through all of this, what are some of the things that, the government's obviously going to have its own response and think things through. But if you're an SME, particularly in an industry that could be impacted, what should you be thinking about? And so if you're the business that's doing some exporting, even if it's on a small basis, in terms of value or volume. Really thinking about other markets. So if the US is a core corridor for you, thinking about other markets is really, really important. So making sure that you're exploring those options if you haven't kind of made some headway already. Things to think about. I think regional trade agreements are important. Some of our other bilateral partners to think through. Looking east is a really viable opportunity, and then just concentrating where we've already got really powerful markets like the EU is another thing to think through. I think that's data highlighting that even in an automotive perspective, Africa is our number 2 destination as a region, or sub-Saharan Africa. That's meaningful. Is that something that we could lean into? And then consider investing in innovation and value addition. So basically, if you're doing unfinished goods, maybe some other markets are looking for those goods but aren't able to increase the value themselves. So where the US was maybe looking for component parts or raw goods or finished goods, other markets may not have their there's the same reasons to consume those goods. So understanding how are we adding value to those goods if it's required, and producing potentially more finished goods for consumption markets instead of markets that are looking to transform those into finished goods is something to really think through. And that might even be an opportunity for us to increase the overall value that we're getting. And then a focus on domestic sales and consumption. I think we've seen with high interest rates, inflation being incredibly high, with a little bit of a downturn in inflation, a dip in inflation, a few reductions in interest rates, hopefully consumption locally and demand locally can increase. And hopefully, there can be more consumption of the goods we're manufacturing locally. So we need our economy to be doing well, and driving some of that consumption and uptake as well. So those are just a few things, very broad, to be thinking through.
Yeah, just to add to that, Thomas, I think it's an important thing. A lot of this just speaks to planning and not short-term thinking for SME owners. And I think it's something we've kind of stressed along the way is, obviously we look at it more from a cash flow perspective in terms of understanding working capital, but from a general business perspective is understanding, what are the potential impacts. No one knows for sure what they are, but understanding and trying to plan for your specific business for exactly these scenarios that Thomas has referred to.
And then in terms of access to credit for industries that could be affected, I think things to keep in mind, whether it's Lula or any other funder out in the market, this is going to be a factor. This is going to factor into that thinking. So your relationship with your financial services businesses, your credit providers, it's really important to think those things through, to make sure that if you are thinking about diversifying, or you're getting new contracts in new regions, or your supply chains being impacted in some way, and you need to basically invest to transform that in some way, really plan your credit needs out. I think the last thing you want to do is get into a state of you're looking for funding just to stay afloat. You definitely want to be looking at funding for growth and investing in things that are going to make a difference in your business. So that's a key message here, I think, to Gart's point: plan. Understand how something like this might change the risk profile of an entire industry. Something like automotive, that risk profile will definitely change, and it's something to keep in mind. We don't know yet exactly how that will be impacted, but it's very much going to be dependent on how the governments interact with each other and how they sort this out. If we do get suspended, how and when that happens. If a renewal doesn't happen for us in particular, or that renewal changes substantively, how could that impact an entire industry and the profile of that industry? So I think planning is absolutely key there. And that's kind of the end of